Hello. Today we're going to today's session is really going to cover some vocabulary and some concepts. So the first is freehold estates. And in your studies and in your books, you might have read this term and it kind of sounds like an odd term, and we definitely don't use it in day-to-day vocabulary in real estate, but it helps to maybe understand that the term freehold estates really comes from medieval England. As you may or may not know, most of our laws come from England. You know, we were colonized by England, and so about 98% of our laws come from English common law. I would say probably about the 2% come from Mexico and Spain, because Spain occupied Mexico and Mexico, occupied California. So, but most of our laws really come from English common law. So when we talk today about freehold estates, it might help to think about medieval Europe, medieval England, right? If you were free, you could hold an interest in real estate, okay? And three types of freehold estates that we want to feel comfortable with that are terms that are legitimate today are fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, and a life estate. So let's jump right in. So hopefully you can see my screen. So a freehold estate is a medieval term for ownership of real estate or real property, right? Real property. And a fee simple absolute or estate of inheritance is kind of the greatest ownership interest you can have in that type of estate. So if you had a choice, you probably want to own real estate as a fee simple. And they describe it a few different ways that we need to make sure we know means the same thing. An estate of inheritance would be the same as a fee simple absolute estate, which would be the same as an estate in fee, or sometimes you might just hear it fee simple. All of them refer to the highest form of ownership. Now, there's one that's a little less, and that one would be fee simple defeasible. Now, why is it a little less? Because in that type of ownership, there's a condition in the deed that if you violate that condition, you may forfeit your ownership. For example, possibly someone wants to sell you a property, but they don't want there ever to be alcohol on the property. So in the deed, there might be a condition that says this property never to have alcohol on it. And a couple of months later, you open up a liquor store drive-through. Well, you'd be in violation of that condition that you agreed to in the deed, and that might allow the previous owner to defeat your ownership and take back that property. So fee simple defeasible is a little lesser ownership than fee simple absolute because there's a condition present. There's a story, I should probably verify this because I say it enough in classes now, that in San Diego, California, some wealthy family, I'm sure, donated hundreds of acres to the city of San Diego many years ago to create the zoo. However, at the time of that transfer, they put a condition in the deed. And again, this is just a story. I have to fact check it, but that the gentleman's wife loved monkeys. And so the giver of the property to the city of San Diego stated in the deed that they must always have at least 20 monkeys in the zoo as a condition of this deed. Well, years went by, and I'm sure the grandkids probably said, "Why did Grandpa give away the millions of dollars of our land?" As some maybe inheritors might think. So one of those grandkids was smart and goes, I noticed there's only 15 monkeys in the zoo because maybe they just didn't have a lot of monkeys that period. So he tried to contest the ownership of the lands that was gifted to the city by saying they were in violation of a condition in the deed by not maintaining a certain amount of monkeys. So you can see it became a big deal. If you don't like the fact that that ownership of that property is subject to a condition, then don't agree to it. Don't buy that property if the seller says that's the only way to get it, or negotiate better so that condition is not part of the deed. However, if there is a condition in the deed and you violate that condition, then your property could be forfeited. And I think on the state exam, they tend to use a question related to alcohol, that there's a condition in the deed that prohibits alcohol. What type of freehold estate does that new owner have? That would be a fee simple defeasible. So we have fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, and these are types of freehold estates, types of real property ownership. Now, it really helps to think medieval England with the third one, a life estate. So a life estate is a type of freehold estate where the person only owns it for the period of their life or someone else's life. You might say, hey, you own this house until Bob dies. So you would have a life estate until Bob dies. Or they could say you own this house until you die. So definitely a life estate is less than the other two, because the other two, you could own it until you die, and then your children could own it. It could be an estate of inheritance. However, with a life estate, that ownership terminates the minute you do, right? So a life estate's ownership for a period of someone's life. Now you might think, well, why would anyone buy it that way? Well, again, if we think back to medieval England, all wealth, like a lot is today, is based on land. So, and it was very easy to know who owned the land back in medieval Europe. The king did, el rey, royal estate, right? Now, maybe some free noblemen could hold interest in or have an estate in real estate, but really the king probably owned everything. And if the king maybe gave you some land, it was probably very important to the kingdom that it went back to them eventually. So he might have given you a life estate. He would grant you ownership for the period of your life, and then it'll go back. So maybe that makes it easier to understand that concept of a life estate. It's only ownership for the period of someone's life, right? Only ownership for the period of someone's life. So let's dig a little deeper into the life estate first, because that kind of gives people a little confusion. So life estate ownership for the period of a holder's life or someone else identified in the deed, meaning you own it until Bob dies, right? Now, because you're going to die, right? There's a reality. Who gets it when you die? Well, if it goes back to the original person that granted that property, deeded that property to you in a life estate, then it would go back to that person. So, and that would be called an estate in reversion. So the person waiting to get it back has an estate in reversion. You who have a life estate, they have an estate in reversion. Now, for some reason at the beginning, it's stated that it's going to go to someone other than the original person that deeded the life estate. Then that other person would be having an estate in remainder. So the balance of that ownership. So that person dies at the life estate and it doesn't go back to the original person. It goes to a third party and they have an estate in remainder. Because it's kind of already decided what's going to happen at the end of the life tenant's life, or the measuring stick, the person who the life estate is based on, then we say a life estate usually cannot be willed. Because obviously if you could will it, that means you could say, no, I'm going to leave it to my dog, or I'm going to leave it to the Humane Society. So a freehold estate is just, this word really just refers to ownership of real estate, real property. Three types of freehold estates that we need to understand is fee simple absolute, which could also be referred to as an estate of inheritance, or just fee simple. And that's the highest form of ownership. A little less, fee simple defeasible, or sometimes this may be called a fee simple qualified estate, meaning there's some condition that if violated could forfeit the ownership. And then a life estate, which is just ownership for the period of someone's life. And then we talked about an estate in remainder and estate in reversion. While we're kind of talking about these freehold estates referring to ownership of real estate, it might be a good time to kind of introduce leasehold estates. So a freehold estate with ownership of real estate. A leasehold estate would be considered less than a freehold estate, meaning as far as your ownership interest, in that a leasehold estate is ownership of the lease, the right of possession, the right to be there, as opposed to the real property. So the owner of the building has a freehold estate. The tenant renting does own something, but they own a right to be there for a contractual period of time in the lease. So they would own a leasehold estate. So who owns leases? tenants do, right? The tenant has a leasehold interest. Who owns the building? The landlord does. The owner, he holds a freehold estate. So it also kind of helps to think back to that medieval Europe. So the lord, right, might own some land. The landlord might own an estate, right? And then he maybe rents it out via the labor of the serfs, right? So kind of, if you think of leasehold estates, are leases owned by tenants, right? And freehold estates are ownership of real property. Now, we're not going to go into the different types of leasehold estates because that's going to be another session, but I wanted you to kind of feel more comfortable with these terms. Freehold estates, ownership of real estate. Leasehold estates, ownership of leases. And of course, we have different types of leasehold estates, estate for years, estate for period to period, and we'll talk about that on another session. Okay, have a great day.